Let me ask you another difficult question. If I were to count back all the world champions, and after all this is the 500th Grand Prix, that if you totaled up all of those great champions, the number of times they had made contact with other drivers, that you in the last 36 months or 48 months have been in contact with more other cars and drivers than they might have done in total.
I find amazing for you to make such a question, Stuart, because you are very experienced and you know a lot about racing. And you should know that by being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And by being a racing driver means you are racing with other people. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. Because we are competing to win. And the main motivation to all of us is to compete for a victory.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tired F1 Pod, and this is part 2 of our little Senna trilogy. And today we're going to have a look at Senna's most famous quote. If there is a gap and you don't go for it, you are no longer a racing driver. Ammar, I think that is one of the most controversial statements in the history of Formula One and responsible for a spate of awful driving. I hate that quote. And I hate it. And I think it paints Senna in a bad light. Tell me I'm wrong.
I can't tell you that you're wrong, because I mean, at least in the last part of it, right? Because I think it did paint Senna wrong, and I don't want him to paint it that way. But go on and tell me why you think what you think.
So look, context is always important, right? So why did he say that? That quote came from an interview that he did with Jackie Stewart. We've played it at the beginning of this video, right? But when did that happen? That happened after he's won his 3rd world championship, and immediately after the incident at Suzuka, where off the start line he runs into the side of Alain Prost. All of the evidence there is that, he was angry from the season before. He was angry about where pole position was, and he'd even said prior to the race that whatever happens, I am going to come out of that first corner first, or neither of us are going to come out of it. And that's exactly what happened. That's what led to Murray Walker's famous commentary at the time. Oh, it's happened immediately. And there they were on the outside of turn 1 in the gravel, both walking away from their cars. Senna had essentially used his car as a missile, and we know that he had because he admitted to it a year later. So in that context, for him to say, if there is a gap and you don't go for it, you are no longer a racing driver, it's an indictment, I think.
Oh my God. Okay. Well,
right. And the reason I hate it so much is because it gave license to drivers that came after him to basically drive like idiots. Schumacher essentially came through that. He was driving at the same time as Senna was, and he saw that, drivers like him looked up to Senna as the idol, as the benchmark. What he says goes. So if he says that if you don't go for a gap, you're no longer a racing driver, then I'm going to do the same thing too. And that led to I think that allowed him, that not just the fact that Senna said that, but the fact that he got away with it, that he won a championship out of it, gave Schumacher the license to do things like he did at Jerez 1997 and turn in on Jacques Villeneuve. Luckily, that was stamped out at that point, and the FIA finally said enough is enough, and we're not going to have our championships won because somebody has done something like that, because they've turned in on someone and won a championship by stopping the other person getting to the end of the race. But Senna started that, and I still see shades of that now. I still see Lewis Hamilton, as recently as Miami 2024 in the sprint race, trying to use drivers as the outside of the corner, saying, oh, well, there was a gap. I'm sorry, but that is, you can't make an illegal maneuver, go out of control, and then say, oh, there was a gap there because Senna said it. And Senna said it because he was trying to make excuses for why he'd essentially run his rival off the road. So I hate it. I hate it because Senna did so many great things in a Formula One car. And we talked about the human side of Senna as well, that he could be compassionate out of it. But this was vindictive, and I hate the way it makes him look. There you go. That's my reason for hating that. Tell me why I'm wrong.
I generally disagree with you, but I cannot disagree a whole lot in the spirit of what you're saying, right? Even though I don't agree in sort of the application of it, right? Which is that, yeah, I think we've seen incidents now where it's just clearly mind-boggling and probably not very appetizing to watch races where you're just seeing Lewis Hamilton in the Miami Sprint. I mean, Kevin Magnussen is at a different level with all of this shit, but even Max Verstappen has been known to kind of do the Max stuff, right? Even Daniel Ricciardo loves to sort of send it in and at various breaking points, right, on turns where he can. I think that this is a matter of degrees and nuances, right? I think the context of what you're trying to do matters, right? What Senna did and what's going against him is the simple fact that this was the race that was going to determine the championship. In Suzuka, he had lobbied for Paul to be on the clean side of the lap, which he was awarded, and subsequently it was sort of rescinded. And I just think that there was so many different circumstances that led to doing what he did. I'd like to believe that if the stakes were slightly different and the situation was slightly different, that he wouldn't have done it quite that way. But I do think it's a matter of when you sort of decide that you're gonna get ahead on that first corner, no matter what. Then I think it becomes very hard for you to control yourself. My guess is he didn't intend to do it quite that way, but he was going to do it anyway. I mean, he had just sort of made up his mind that he was not going to let Prost through no matter what, right? And that was just it. But what, you're going to say something?
No, I can't agree with that. Like, how can you say that just because the championship's at risk or it's on the line, that makes it okay to run your driver?
No, I'm not saying it's. Well, I'm not saying it's ever okay to do that, but I'm just saying that the way that, I mean, look, this is all history now, right? So, in the way that it was dealt with, I can see why they wouldn't want to have meddled with this too, right? I mean, look, we just had the exact opposite in some ways of what happened in Abu Dhabi 21, although it had nothing to do with the drivers, right? But you saw
it had nothing to do with the drivers.
It had nothing to do, and these are not apples to apples comparison.
Different.
And there's going to be no two situations like this that are the same, right? So all I can go off of is sort of the psyche of the people that are managing the race and sort of doing that. So I think you're definitely right to sort of argue that he should have been given a penalty or whatever was appropriate at the time to have been given. But then at the end result,
I mean, Ammar, if you look at the penalty in Jerez 1997, Schumacher tries to turn in on Jacques Villeneuve. He ends up in the gravel, and essentially he wouldn't have won that championship anyway because he didn't finish and Jacques Villeneuve did. But Schumacher was thrown out of that year's championship, wasn't he? Yeah. He lost all his points. So he will forever not be second in the 1997 World Championship. But you can argue that in 1994, he purposefully turned in on Damon Hill.
Yeah,
right.
He did,
and again, he was given that championship. But the fact that he had the gall to kind of go, whatever, I'm happy to put my rival out of the race was he was afforded that precedent by Senna doing it 4 years earlier.
Yeah, but I mean, eventually it went away, right? Like, I mean, I think part of this also goes back to the non-racing element of it, right? Which is Formula One was trying to grow itself back then, as it is now too, right? And we even have this debate in this day and age about what is an overtake and how should it be done? What happens if you run somebody off track? What happens if you turn into them? This is going to be a debate as long as time, right? Like it's going to be one of those things. So I completely agree with you. Look, I'm on board with you with the idea of that just feels distasteful. And I think again now that Senna is long gone, we sort of look at that in a much less negative light than we did back then.
You might. I don't.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, some of us, those are more reasonable, look at it.
You think it's reasonble?
No, I don't think so.
Put your rival off the road to then use
I don't.
Ad infinitum is reasonable.
No, look, I mean, look, if they wanted to put a stop to it, they could have done it in the very subsequent years.
I'm
So
not
if they let it
okay.
happen in '94, that's on them, right?
Okay,
It
so
didn't
Ben,
have to
this
wait
is
like 4 years.
this isn't about for me. This isn't about
What are you saying?
that
Then? You want
scenario. My issue is with the quote itself. I cannot agree with the
Yeah, but I
quote.
love that. I love that. Look, listen, this is a moment of him being human, which is he's been
No, it's not.
godly
It's him being
all
a
of.
child. It's him
Okay,
being a
but that is
child, is what
also
it is.
okay. But it's also being a human being, right? Like look. At least, man, how many times we do this? We want our athletes to tell the world how they feel about things, and we want them to. We put them on this pedestal, and we'll want them to be like standing up for all the right things, and yada yada yada. And then when you get an honest sort of moment from him,
He wasn't
and
being
we turn
honest.
him.
That's my problem with it. He was not being honest. He
Okay,
wasn't going for that gap because it was there. He was going for that gap because he didn't want Alain Prost to win.
okay,
And he
fine, but that
did
is the
finally
honesty.
admit it.
Okay,
The
yes, yeah,
honesty
but he
came
did
the
admit.
year after.
Okay, but it did then, right? Because obviously, oh well, listen, okay, but what did you want for him to never admit it? Like you want him to have gone down having never admitted? Yeah, at least to me, he had the
I
guts
didn't
to
want him
admit
to
it
have said
even
that
later.
gap quote. I didn't want him to say that silly gap quote because look, you can
Okay,
even see
well,
it in the video, that little smirk on his face. He knows that what he's saying is
yeah,
completely.
but okay, but you do agree that there is a lot that happens over the course of a season that we get to know of, and then there's a lot more that we never get to know of. And I think quotes like that, they are the tip of the iceberg, right? And we get to see only those slight moments. Like there is tension all around. There's high stakes championship egos involved, like game of inches, game of centimeters, whatever millimeters. Like so,
That
I
makes it
don't
okay
like.
to run your
Yeah,
rival off the
because
road.
no, it doesn't make it okay. But we're talking about the quote here, not the pushing off the road. But we're talking about the quote specifically, right?
Those
Like
two things go
I,
together.
yeah, but
That's
they
why
do.
I added that
Okay,
context.
but that was his psyche then, right? So I mean, look, we're gonna revere the guy for all of this, and so you take the good and the bad and the ugly. That's how it is. But we cannot have the perfect prototypical Formula One race driver or any athlete or any human being for that matter. Like there's gonna be flaws, and this was his flaw, and that's we just have to accept it for what it is. Look, if they didn't want to take the championship away from him, that's on them, man. Like that's just like us going back and
Okay.
relitigating something
Okay,
else, right? Like
yeah,
we could have.
but we're leaving the argument again, man. My issue with this is the way that that quote has now been used by so many drivers. So and it's still being
Okay,
used
but
now. Oh my god, I've
all
got so
right.
excited I've hit my mic. It's still being
Calm
used
down.
now as an excuse for dumb moves that were never
Okay,
going to
but
happen.
but now more than ever, we know how to legislate those things out of the sport, right? Like there are ways to give penalties. We have 5 second penalties, 10 second penalties. Whatever KMAC does, though, right? I mean, like those kind of things. That is not up to look. Drivers are going to look at other drivers before them as inspirationals, as models, whatever it might be. I mean, look, how many drivers are going to look at the way Max is driving now, and now he's fine because. But at the height of 21, I mean, that was a pretty,
Yeah.
pretty terrible year too
But
in that regard, right?
yeah,
So,
but my problem with it is that it allowed drivers in the immediate aftermath to think that that was okay, that to run into a silly gap that was never going to be there and run your rival off the road because he said that. It made it okay. And I know that it doesn't have to be like that. Like in the middle of the noughties, you saw what driving standards were like. Did you ever see your idol, Kimi Raikkonen, drive somebody off the road? No. He would leave a gap. And yet he was still able to have moments like Suzuka 2005. You know, he didn't have to use his car as a weapon. He didn't have to drive angry. He just did it.
but
You know,
but you made
Jensen
you
Button, Fernando Alonso, like
okay,
Alonso wouldn't drive like that.
but you're making my point
Lewis
for
built his
me now.
Lewis built
But
his entire career off the back of not driving like that. And yet
okay,
now we come back in the cycle and you have drivers like Max who are happy to shove it down the inside even when there isn't a
okay,
gap.
okay.
And
Listen,
Lewis is now using
but
the same excuses as well.
no, look, listen, man. You just made the argument against you, right? You
Go
just
on,
gave
hit me.
examples of drivers that have won without having to do that. And what I'm here to tell
Yes.
you is that some people will drive like Senna because that's what some people, not even inspired by Senna, will drive like Senna because that's how they think about it. It has nothing to do with Senna. For crying out loud, it could have been someone else who gave that quote. It could have been Fangio that gave that quote. It
But it
doesn't
wasn't.
matter.
It was Senna.
There are,
It's
okay,
Fox
it
and
was
Davies,
Senna.
man. It was him.
It was Senna, but so what? We're gonna pick on his one sentence, and now that's license. That's on you, man.
Yeah,
That's
because it
on
had a
you.
huge
As you
impact on
just said,
on the quality of driving.
just rattled off 3 drivers that have been highly successful that have not had to drive that way. So there you go. Some people do, and some people don't, and that's just how the sport works. And if it's over the line, that's up to the FIA and Formula One to make the rules and regulations to be able to kind of curtail that. That's not on the drivers. So the drivers are going to drive. Like, and this is why, I mean, look, man, this is why I hate Prost, because he always kind of played this calculated game of like, oh my God, I'm just going to race as slowly as I can and wear everyone out. Like, that to me is a shitty way to drive too. But okay,
Why?
he did it
Why
that
is
way.
it a crap way to drive? Why is that
It
not
is a
like,
crap way.
like, I don't know
That's
why
not-
this is turning into a I hate Prost
Well, 'cause
session. But
it isn't.
but-
It isn't. But I'm just here to tell you that that's one style of driving, and the way Senna looked at things is another style of driving. And I think they both need
the
to be there
aggressive
because
put your opponent out of the race.
some people
style.
do. Well, look. I mean, look. This is what you are taking it to the extreme where you're playing the result of that. It can just be that you can push the driver to or the guy you're trying to overtake into a mistake by getting so close. And this is a game of inches, right? Crossing the
That's a
line
very
or staying
Fernando
within
Alonso
the
way
line.
of driving. I think that's
Correct.
perfectly acceptable.
That's fine. So that's where
Pushing somebody into a mistake is
but this is but then okay,
Half
but
of the
pushing
course.
someone into pushing someone into making a mistake and making a mistake yourself. The margins are very fine in this, and it's a millisecond thing, and it's all dependent on like 2 drivers respecting each other. I mean, look, there's a great
But this was
example of
this was
the British Grand Prix,
intentional,
right?
though.
Well, what about Silverstone 21, where Lewis and Max got into it at Copse, right? And Max ended up being out of the race, but in that same race, Lewis overtook Charles, and the 2 drivers gave each other space. So this is also a matter of interpersonal rivalry, interpersonalities, all of that. And look, Prost and Senna weren't friends, right? We know that, right? So maybe it would have been different had it been a different driver. It could just be that. It doesn't have to be a judgment on Senna's racing character or attributes. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, right?
He admitted
I disagree.
that he tried to put his rival off the
Yes,
road.
and I can't wait for Lewis Hamilton to come back and reflect on 21, and same with Max. Like, and I'm sure you'll hear quotes like that too. But that doesn't mean that Kimi Antonelli will take that with him and do that. If he does, well, that's between him and the people who are refereeing the sport. It's okay for you to be that way, right? Like, as we say in America, there's freedom, but there's a consequence for the actions you take. So we're saying that we're asking Senna to not be himself. I just don't think that can happen. That's who Senna was. You take it, whether you dislike it or not. That's who he is.
Oof.
And I'm glad he was gutsy enough. Look, this is in the middle of his career too. It's not like this was in a tell-all book in retirement or like a tell-all interview way after he was done. He was still in the thick of things. So I applaud that. Like, I love that.
Ammar, I cannot applaud somebody that tries to put his rival off the road, then as
Only
an
that one, though, by the way.
as an excuse makes that comment, because he wasn't trying to go for a gap. He was
It wasn't an
trying to put
excuse.
his,
It was an explanation. It was not an excuse. It was an explanation. He was asked that.
Yeah,
Okay,
it was
but
an
he was
excuse
also asked that too, right?
Because a year later he said, "Yeah, I tried to put the guy off the road."
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
Cool.
He
It is
came
what
out
it
and
is.
said it. I was angry
I mean,
about 1989. That's why I put Ammar off the road.
Yeah, look, man,
He
there
was
had
still
been a
angry,
lot
wasn't he?
happening between the two. There had been a lot happening. Again, we are looking at the tip of the iceberg, the end result, the sort of the finality of the season, right? But there was just so much happening where, yeah, I mean, look, when 2 people get into a fight or into an argument, they might say things they might not want to say otherwise. They might not feel that. I just look at it the same way. This is
When 2 people get into a fight, they don't drive their car into the other at
because
130
most
miles
2
an
people
hour.
aren't. Well, 2 people can argue over a podcast, but they can't really drive each other off the road. I would drive you off the road too if I could right now, but
Okay. I think on that bombshell, I think we're gonna have to draw to a conclusion. Ammar is happy to drive me off the road. If there is a gap, he will go for it.
I cannot wait for that. Let's see it, guys. Let's do it. When I started GoFundMe on that.
Yeah, and as always, we at the Tired F1 Pod are also looking for every gap, and we are trying to drive into it too. If you like this video, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. We read every single one, and as ever, we try and reply to as many as we can. Oof.